What if a second American Civil War broke out? The American Civil War was a conflict from 1861 to 1865 between the United States of America/the Union/the North, and the Confederate States of America/the Confederacy/the South. The North was led by Abraham Lincoln until he got assassinated and his vice president Andrew Johnson became president, and the South was led by Jefferson Davis. Whatever a Dixie may tell you, the reason for the outbreak was the institution of slavery, and once the Confederacy was defeated, it was abolished. So far there has never been a civil war in the United States ever again, though it is a popular alternate history concept, like the Second American Civil War in Kaiserreich between the federal government, Union State syndicalists, Pacific states, and New England. But what if that didn't happen? What if a second American Civil War broke out? In this timeline, the January 6th riots were more successful and the Trumpists secure Washington, D.C. Donald Trump then essentially becomes a despot with elections and the rule of law being dismantled. The government under Joe Biden would flee to Boston and establish a rival government, and soon enough places that voted Democratic in the 2020 presidential election, and even some Republican counties rise up in support of Joe Biden. Joe Biden is internationally recognized as the legitimate president of the United States, and would get support from American allies like fellow NATO members. Meanwhile, Trump gets support from Russia, China, and North Korea. Russia hopes that Trump, who is friendly to Putin, remains in power, while China wants to prolong the civil war. On the side of Biden stands all Democrats and some Republicans like Liz Cheney, Chris Christie, or Mitt Romney. The Democrats and Republicans in Boston would form the National Union Party to maintain stability, just like Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Biden also has support from most of the military, while Trump can balance this somewhat out with militias like the Proud Boys. The Trumpists would see their first defeat in Oregon when Unionists capture the county of Douglas and the port city of Reedsport. The Unionists are now in control of the entire West Coast. The Unionists would also see victory in New England as they managed to connect the New England front with the Michigan front, cutting the Trumpists of Lake Erie. They also took over Trumpist enclaves in New York and Maine. Fearing that D.C. might fall, the Trumpists launched an offensive into Pennsylvania and New Jersey and drive the Unionists off of the states for the most part. In the Deep South, the Black Belt managed to unify with the Northern Black Belt, and with Atlanta and the Gulf Coast. But near Tallahassee, the Trumpists managed to retake the coastline and connect with the Trumpists in North Florida, South Alabama, and South Mississippi, but were driven out of southern Florida, creating an enclave in an enclave. After intensive fighting, Trumpists would secure the Texas Triangle and southeastern Texas. Many of the Unionists would flee to Mexico, where they would be disarmed. In the Southwest, the Unionists cut off a lot of Arizona and New Mexico, which would then fall. In the Great Lakes front, the Trumpists would be forced to rethreat to northern Michigan and the northern peninsula, with Unionists securing the rest of the Great Lakes region. Most of the smaller Democratic enclaves would fall to the Trumpists, with the exception being St. Louis, which holds out despite of being leveled to the ground. By the end of the year, the fronts would start to stabilize and the Unionists are split into the Pacific Front, or Western Front, Great Lakes Front, or Northern Front, and the Black Belt Front, or Southern Front. In 2022, Unionists would launch the Rocky Mountains Offensive, and it was a great success. They pushed the Trumpists to the Rocky Mountains and the Rio Grande River, but were pushed out of some other minor territories in New Mexico. This actually benefited both sides. The Pacific Front was the strongest of the three Unionist strongholds, and thus, with a front along the Rocky Mountains, Trumpists hope that they can now hold them for a long time period and focus on the other two strongholds, and then destroy them. Unionists would also see a breakthrough in Florida, and Governor Ron DeSantis would have to surrender his forces, which means that the Unionists now also control the Deep South. In the Great Lakes region, the Trumpists in Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, who'd been besieged and were starving, finally surrendered. Trumpists did, however, get a victory when they cut off the Great Lakes front from the New England front again. Trumpists also finally captured St. Louis, but at that point, after months of artillery bombardment, it can't be called a city anymore. It has now become apparent that Trump probably will lose this civil war as he lost in all three major fronts. In 2023, Unionists would launch an offensive starting from the Deep South and Great Lakes. Similar how Ulysses S. Grant moved along the Mississippi River to cut of the Confederacy, they launch a two-fronts offensive to cut of the Trumpists. It was a success, and by July 1, only the former St. Louis was left, and Trumpists against the orders of Donald Trump would withdraw. Unionists wouldn't enter the city until July 4 on the Independence Day. Now the Great Lakes and Deep South Front are connected, and the Trumpists are cut of in two. In the east, the only ports they have are New Orleans, which is besieged since the war begun, and Houston. The further north you go, the further atrocious the supply gets, and so they made the decision to withdraw south of the Arkansas River. With that, the Pacific Front managed to connect with the Mississippi River Front. The winter of 2023 to 2024 would be horrendous in Texas, and a large uprising occurred in Texas, and the locals managed to force Greg Abbott to abdicate. Texas then rejoins the Union and aid is brought over. In 2024, Donald Trump would order an invasion of New England with the aim being Boston. The offensive was a success and defeat. The Trumpists had higher casualties and only managed to push to the Hudson River and even failed to take New York City. Trump can now see the writing on the wall, and he is getting pushed back on all fronts. His last hope was that Joe Biden might lose the election of 2024, but his hopes were shattered when Republicans stated that they would not put up their own candidate for as long as the Civil War is going on. By November of 2024, Trump was only left with Maryland, Delaware, northeastern Virginia, and Washington, D.C. As the Republicans promised, they put up no candidate, and Joe Biden won a mapist. On January 6, 2025, Donald Trump would have to order the final withdrawal to Washington, D.C. On February 1, the Battle of Washington begun, and Trumpists would surrender en masse, and the Unionists lay siege to Congress, and the White House demanding them to surrender. Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell would comply and surrender Congress without bloodshed. Meanwhile, Trump still refuses to give up, and fighting ensues between Trump's loyal guard and the Unionist forces. When they finally reach the Oval Office, they find Donald Trump having shot himself. But he failed even at that task, and the shot didn't outright kill him. With that, the Civil War would be over in a victory for the Biden administration. But that very same year, in a trip to Salt Lake City, Joe Biden would be killed by Craig D. Robertson, similar of how John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln. Kamala Harris would become the 47th U.S. president and the first female president. As for Trump, he would be found guilty on treason, armed insurrection, and a whole load more, and would be killed. Many other prominent Trumpists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, or Matt Gaetz would be sent to prison. The United States would then need to be rebuilt. The National Unity Party would be dismantled, with the Democratic Party and Republican Party going their separate ways again. In 2028, the Republican Party nominates Chris Christie as their presidential nominee, as he gained popularity due to his stance against Donald Trump. However, his stance also made him a lot of enemies, and many on the right refused to vote or voted for other parties, which resulted in Kamala Harris winning with 350 electoral votes against his 188. Her running mate and vice president is Pete Buttigieg. Republicans also saw defeat in Congress. The Democrats hold 244 seats in the House, while the Republicans only do 191. In the Senate, it is 55 to 45. With that, the Democratic Party is in control of both chambers and the executive branch, and is able to do as it pleases, for example expanding LGBTQ rights or bills to protect the environment. A vote would be held whether D.C. should become a state, and with both the House and the Senate voting in favor, it was up to the president to sign the bill, which she did. And with that, the Douglas Commonwealth, or just Douglas, becomes the 51st U.S. state. They would get 1 seat in the House and 2 seats in the Senate, meaning Democrats now have 245 seats in the House and 57 in the Senate. The District of Columbia would be massively shrunk, and would just contain Congress, the White House, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Monument. In 2032, the Democratic Party would nominate Jared Polis as their presidential candidate. Meanwhile, in order to win the Trumpist vote, the Republican Party nominated Ron DeSantis as their presidential nominee, who just barely didn't go to jail. But this backfired because many swing voters voted for Polis as DeSantis was seen as too close to Trump, and while he won over Florida, he lost in Texas, Iowa, and Ohio. Jared Polis would become the 48th U.S. president, with his vice president being Senator from Oregon Ron Wyden. In the Senate, Democrats now hold 61 seats, and in the House 276 seats. The Republican Party would after this be in complete disarray, and when they just couldn't agree on a presidential nominee, the Republican Party split in two. The moderates would join the Libertarian Party while the radicals joined the Constitution Party. In the 2036 election, the Libertarians nominated Austin Peterson, and the Constitution Party nominated Josh Hawley. This, however, just caused the right vote to be split, and Polis won with 479 electoral votes. In both chambers of the House, Democrats would hold over two-thirds of the seats, which means they may pass or abolish amendments. In 2040, the Democratic Party would nominate Joe Kennedy III, the Libertarians nominate Rand Paul, and the Constitution Party nominates Elise Stefanik, with Joe Kennedy winning. He then won re-elections in 2044 against Libertarian Mike Lee and Constitution Donald Trump Jr. At this point, the Democrats won every election ever since 2020, so 7 elections in a row, and won all but one election ever since 2008, which was 36 years ago. In his second term, Kennedy would see increasing tensions in his own party, namely between the liberals and progressives. The 2048 Democratic primaries were a deadlock because liberals wanted Pete Buttigieg as president while progressives preferred a Vo seat. In the end, the party split into the Progressive Party and the Democratic Party. The 2048 presidential election would be split into 4, with the Libertarian candidate being Thomas Massie and the Constitution candidate being Madison Cawthorn. Nobody would get 270 electoral votes, and so the Hood elects Massie despite of a Vo C winning the most votes. Obviously, the Senate and House are also split in 4, and so the Libertarians enter into a coalition with the Democrats. This convinced Alaska, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Maine to sign the NPVIC, which ensures that the candidate with the most votes wins the election. Obviously, the most powerful nation in the world falling into civil war would have huge ramifications. All U.S. forces deployed in other countries would have to withdraw to help in the civil war, and this includes Afghanistan. In 2022, Russia would invade Ukraine, and with the USA in its civil war and the West rather supporting Biden over Zelensky, Ukraine would fall by 2023. Emboldened by this, China would invade Taiwan in 2023 and quickly take it, but like Russia in Ukraine, they would face huge casualties. In response, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Australia, and New Zealand would form the Indo-Pacific Treaty Organization, or IPTO. Meanwhile, countries that used to rely on the U.S. would have to be more independent or search for a new security guarantor. Macron would use this opportunity to push for a united EU army, and with Russia just having invaded Ukraine, they managed to get it through. Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries that rely on the U.S. would have to find another friend, maybe China or Russia. With the U.S. having finished its civil war, it would try to re-establish its sphere, for example by joining the IPTO, but some countries like Saudi Arabia would be rather reluctant to be in the U.S. sphere again. The U.S. wouldn't be the sole great power anymore, as the Civil War had weakened it, and now China and Russia threatened the United States. In this timeline, the Civil War would result in a defeat for Trump, and the United States would become weaker. This would also cause the end of the Republican Party and soon later the end of the two-party system. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.